Under the scorching sun of central Texas, the air seemed to freeze in place. The ground cracked and yellowed like the skin of a dying beast. The wind brushed across brittle, dry grass, not carrying the fragrance of wildflowers, but the stench of dust and scorched earth. On that barren land, a figure moved slowly and unsteadily toward an old farmhouse with a rusted red tin roof baked beneath the drought's blaze. It was a pregnant bobcat, Soraya, her once sleek spotted coat, now ragged, matted in patches. Her heavy belly dragged along the ground like one final burden before collapse. Soraya had been walking for 2 days straight, without rest, without water, without food. Since the hunting grounds of her territory had been invaded by construction machines, had vanished, streams dried up. Now cornered by maternal instinct, Soraya had risked leaving the forest she once knew, headed toward the very place she'd been taught to avoid where humans lived. On the dusty, decaying porch of the farmhouse, Koda, the shepherd dog, was dozing in the midday heat when he suddenly sprang upright. A sound, no, a shift in rhythm had struck his sixth sense. Koda, with his sun-dappled silver-gray coat, didn't bark. Instead, he shot to his feet. Muscles taut, his heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one amber, fixed on the open field. Something was coming. Not a human, not a car, not a coyote. Something that carried both danger and a plea for help. Inside the house, Dr. Helen, a 42-year-old veterinarian who had just moved from the city back to her ancestral ranch to escape the wreckage of divorce, was pinning the last photo onto the wall. Her veterinary diploma from the University of Texas still sat in its oak frame, a symbol of years she had spent healing wild animals. Koda, she called, realizing the dog was no longer in his usual spot. No response. Her instincts lit up like a warning siren. Helen set the frame down and stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. And then she saw it, about 50 meters away, a figure dragging itself step by step across the field. It was unmistakable. A pregnant bobcat. No. No way, Helen whispered, stepping back on instinct. At that moment, Koda, trained in basic obedience, but never exposed to wild predators, leapt off the porch. Koda, stop, Helen screamed in panic. But the dog wasn't running like a predator. He crouched low, as if approaching something afraid. Helen stood frozen. The wind seemed to still, and from the bottom of her heart, a deep instinct rose. Something beyond understanding was unfolding, something that surpassed the instincts of any species. And the lives of all three, the woman, the dog, the cat, would never be the same again. Helen ran back into the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She tore through the still unopened moving boxes, searching for the medical kit, searching for the tranquilizer gun. Something that might save a life, or bring disaster if things got out of control. Koda, please don't, she murmured, as she hurriedly assembled the tranquilizer rifle. Just in time, she rushed back onto the porch and froze. Out there, beneath the scorching sunlight that cloaked everything like fire, Koda was lying flat on the ground, barely 3 meters away from Soraya. The pregnant bobcat. No aggression, no barking, no growling. Only silence, charged with reverence, as if two beings from different worlds were negotiating in the language of survival. Despite being on the brink of collapse, Soraya raised her head, her golden eyes narrowing in a predator's final reflex defense. A faint growl rose from her parched throat. Koda immediately pressed himself lower, head between his paws, neck extended gently, like a puppy, seeking acceptance from the mother of another species. A soft sound escaped his mouth, a quiet, whimpering plea. Helen stood several yards away, the tranquilizer rifle dangling in her hand. She didn't dare move an inch. She had seen dogs slashed to death by a bobcat's claws. She had injected dying wild animals back from the edge, but she had never seen anything like this. The bobcat hissed again, weaker. Koda didn't move. His heterochromatic eyes blinked slowly. No threat, only a silent plea. And then the miracle happened. Soraya lowered her head to the ground, her body trembling but no longer tense. Koda inched forward, inch by inch, until his body lay beside the wild feline. And then, he gently licked her ear. Helen covered her mouth, tears welling up not from emotion, but from realizing what was at stake. Two creatures offering each other a chance to survive in a world that never permits it. If she wanted to save them, now was the time. "Good boy, Koda. Don't move," she whispered, loading the syringe with just enough tranquilizer to calm Soraya without harming the fragile lives inside her. She raised the rifle, took a steady breath, and the dart embedded itself into Soraya's thigh. The bobcat let out a sharp cry, but didn't lunge. Within seconds, her body began to relax. Her breathing remained labored, but steadier. Koda turned his head to Helen, eyes saying, "Your turn now." "Save her." Helen stepped forward, knelt beside the two bodies. One wild, one domesticated, lying side by side, like warriors who had just survived their first battle. She placed a hand on Koda first, stroking his spine gently. "You're an extraordinary dog, Koda." Then she placed her hand on Soraya, feeling the faint warmth beneath her tangled fur. The bobcat's belly was taut, uneven signs of premature labor. Helen knew. Without immediate medical intervention, both Soraya and her unborn kittens would die. And in that moment, she also knew. She had found the reason to stay in the very place she once thought was just a place to hide. Helen pulled the curtain shut in the room she had once planned to make her home office. Now, under her quick but steady hands, it became an improvised emergency station for a wildlife, the kind no textbook ever taught her how to treat, especially not while it lay beside a dog. She laid Soraya on a folding table, hastily covered with an old blanket left behind by her grandfather. Koda stood close, not taking his eyes off the unconscious bobcat, his gaze tense, tracking every breath. "No, Koda," Helen said, as she saw the dog attempting to climb onto the table. "You did great. Now let me handle the rest." But instead of walking away, Koda laid down beside the table head, resting on the edge, just inches from where Soraya lay. The way he stared, the resolve in his posture made Helen pause. She looked at him. "You think you have to stand guard for her, don't you?" Koda closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. No movement. No reply. But none was needed. The heat outside seemed to vanish, replaced by the urgency inside the room. Helen hooked up an IV drip, hanging a bag of fluids on a makeshift stand built from an old bamboo cane. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the catheter into Soraya's front leg vein. "Don't stop breathing. Please don't stop breathing," she whispered, watching the clear solution trickle through the tube into a body drained by exhaustion. She couldn't lose her. Not again, not like the lioness last year. Near Soraya's belly, the signs of premature labor were becoming obvious light, but scattered contractions. Her abdomen rose and fell with uneven rhythm. Helen gently touched it and felt life within, clinging to their mother, frail and fragile, like the dry grass in summer drought. "No, not yet, little ones," she said, sweat soaking the back of her shirt, but her hands unwavering in motion. She injected a small dose of anti-labor medication, along with supporting vitamins and minerals, hoping to delay delivery. Each injection, each adjustment felt like a step along the edge between triumph and failure. Koda never moved. His chin remained pressed to the table's edge, his two-toned eyes watching Helen's every move. When she lifted one of Soraya's legs to attach fetal heart monitor leads, Koda whimpered quietly, as if afraid she'd hurt his patient. Helen glanced over. "You're more worried than I am." Koda blinked slowly. Night began to fall outside the window. Helen turned on a small lamp and attached a sensor to the portable heart rate monitor she'd brought from her old rescue center. The screen flickered, then began to display the pulses. 1, 2, 3. 3 separate heartbeats, she whispered. 3 kittens. Still alive. She stood still for a moment, her hand resting gently on Soraya's belly, feeling the tiny lives inside, fighting to stay in this world with nothing but instinct. She knew if they could keep things stable for 24 to 48 more hours, the kittens had a chance to be born safely. But that would require constant vigilance. She pulled a chair close to the table and turned to Koda. "All right. You're in charge of emotional support. I'll handle the technical stuff." Koda tilted his head, then laid his chin back on the table, eyes never leaving Soraya. In a room thick with the scent of medicine, in an old house nestled in the sunburnt plains, a doctor, a dog, and a bobcat were locked in a quiet battle against the threshold of life and death. A strange triangle, but one made of hope. The night passed in a silence stretched tight like a drawn string. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in steady beats, marking each minute. Soraya held on. Helen dozed off in an old wooden chair beside the table, her head bowed, hands still loosely clutching the folder of medical notes. On the table, the monitor continued to flash steadily, 3 small blue signals, blinking in rhythm, proof that the 3 tiny lives inside were still fighting. Koda didn't sleep. He lay beside the edge of the table like a shaggy statue, eyes open, ears always tilted toward the sound of Soraya's breathing. Suddenly, a soft sound, a light scratching coming from somewhere, inside the room. Helen woke with a start, turning her head toward Soraya. The bobcat was awake. Her eyes opened slightly, golden and tired, yet piercing, like 2 fragments of sun emerging after rain. She let out a weak, low growl, cautious. Helen immediately stood, her hand instinctively brushing the tranquilizer gun nearby, but she didn't act hastily. She knew this moment mattered. "Good morning," Helen said softly, her voice steady and low, not moving too close. "You're in a safe place. I'm a doctor. And this is Koda." Soraya narrowed her eyes, growled again, longer this time, her legs shifting slightly with effort. Koda suddenly stood. Helen instinctively raised a hand to stop him, but paused. The dog moved forward, low to the ground, tail wagging gently, as though approaching a feral kitten, not a legendary predator. Just a few steps from the table, Koda let out a familiar sound, a short, warm whimper like a greeting. Soraya turned her head. Their eyes met. The eyes of the wild met the eyes of a companion. Seconds passed in breathless silence. No one moved. Then, gently, Soraya stopped growling. Her head dropped onto the old blanket, her eyes still fixed on Koda, but no longer resisting. Helen stepped forward slowly. She held out a small tray inside a bowl of electrolyte solution. Every motion calculated, no direct eye contact, no surprises, no sudden moves. Soraya sniffed, hesitated. Then, licked. A big step. Helen whispered, her heart pounding as if she were in an open-heart surgery. She offered a small spoon of boiled chicken next. This time, Soraya didn't hesitate. She ate. Slowly, weakly. But she ate. Koda turned to Helen, his eyes almost joyful. Helen smiled softly. Looks like you just made friends with a forest legend. She gently ran her hand along Koda's back, full of gratitude. His presence had done what no medicine or machine possibly could. It broke the boundary of instinct between two species. A soft breeze slipped through the window, carrying the scent of cracked earth and the faint aroma of dried grass. In a world where nature was groaning under hardship, three beings, one human, one dog, one wildcat, had formed a fragile yet enduring alliance, woven from instinct, trust, and a touch of miracle. Helen stood, took her phone, and snapped a photo. Soraya eating Koda resting beside her, sunlight spilling through the window and casting the room in a glow both magical and warm. The first photo in a journey Helen had never imagined, born from a blistering summer day. As twilight fell, pale golden light began to deepen the color of the old tin roof, and the sound of insects rose from the dry grass. Something in the air shifted, not fear, but anticipation, as if even the earth and sky were holding their breath for the faint heartbeat inside Soraya's womb. Helen had just set down her stethoscope when Koda suddenly stood quietly, stepping toward the table. He peered at Soraya with a kind of awareness that no machine could ever measure. "What is it?" Helen asked softly. Soraya stirred, not from fear or discomfort, but pain. A clear contraction. She growled low, not in threat, but in warning. Motherhood had taken over. The time had come. Helen sprang into action. She disconnected the IV-gathered towels, gloves, sterilized tools. All of it had been ready for days, but she had still hoped for more time. "Not now," she whispered. "You're not strong enough yet, Soraya. Please, hold on a little longer." But Soraya couldn't hear that prayer. Her body tightened again, belly contracting. Labor had begun. There was no turning back. Sweat dotted Helen's forehead as she leaned in to check. Her heart sank. The fetuses were small, their bones still soft, lungs underdeveloped. The chance of survival thin as morning mist. Soraya writhed, hissing faintly, teeth clenched, but not screaming, a quiet dignity. Only the wild could hold, even in agony. Koda approached, lying beside the table, his eyes fixed on her. Then Helen witnessed something she would remember for the rest of her life. A large, calloused paw. Koda's slowly lifted to the table's edge, touching the corner of the blanket Soraya lay on. Not stroking, not intruding. Just touching. A silent message. Helen hardly dared breathe. "Soraya," she whispered, "you're not alone. We're here. Koda and I will help you." A long whimper rose from Soraya's throat. Then her belly tensed again, strong and unmistakable. "All right," Helen murmured, slipping on her gloves. "The first one's coming." The room fell into silence, except for the thunder of Helen's heartbeat. She reached out, caught the first newborn, a kitten so small it hurt to look at light, as a fallen leaf, fur damp, and eyes sealed shut. "Please," Helen prayed as she wiped its mouth and nose, rubbing its chest gently. A faint cry broke the silence, a fragile, real sound. It was breathing alive. Helen breathed, eyes misting. Soraya strained again, harder this time. The second, then the third, kitten came into the dusky light, each weak, but alive. All three were female, spotted fur, barely defined their breathing like threads, trembling and delicate. Helen couldn't look away. Koda lay quietly nearby, head lowered, breathing steady. No growls, no movement, just presence, like a pillar of calm. And in that suspended moment between life and death, Soraya turned her head. She looked at Helen, then at Koda. and it was no longer the wild, hardened stare of a bobcat. It was the look of a mother, grateful, exhausted, and trusting. Helen cradled the towel holding the 3 tiny lives. In the thickening dark, falling over the drought-stricken land, a miracle had taken place. Not through science, but through courage, hope, and a dog named Koda, who had quietly done what humans can only call impossible. Night had fully fallen. The Texas countryside sky was pitch black with only a few scattered stars, blinking faintly in the distance. The night wind carried the scent of dry earth and dust, slipping through the cracks of the old wooden shed, now turned makeshift infirmary. Helen sat silently on a folding chair by the table. She wrapped the 3 kittens in soft towels, keeping them close to a warm water bottle nestled beside Soraya. The entire room was lit only by the dim glow of a headlamp hung on a wall hook, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the mother bobcat and her newborns. Soraya had drifted off. After the agony of birth, she was drained, her body still tense, but no longer alert. Her slender head rested on the blanket, her breathing even trembling in waves, the instinctual reflex of survival. Koda lay right at the table's edge, eyes fixed on the tiny lives. Now and then he would lift his head and let out a soft whine, as if checking each of their breaths. No commands, no instructions, just presence. Helen turned to him. "You know," she said, her voice hoarse after the long day, "if you were human, they'd call you the head nurse." Koda blinked, not as if he understood, but as if he agreed. A seasoned nod from someone who'd been through battle and returned carrying life. Helen leaned her head against the wooden wall, exhausted. But inside her was a strange feeling, one she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was over, but because she knew she was in the right place at the right time. She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the sounds of the night. The faint hum of crickets, the soft breathing of 3 fragile lives, and the occasional scrape of Koda's claws on the wooden floor, as if he were making sure everything was still okay. Until rustle. Helen's eyes flew open. Koda had jumped up, his whole body stiff. A gust swept through the dry grass, but it wasn't just wind. It was something moving, fast, heavy, silent. Then the sound of brush being pushed aside near the back of the yard, the one side of the shed that had no window. Helen stood. Her hand touched the first aid box, then paused. She glanced at Koda now, standing at the shed's door like a shadow, utterly silent. His muscles pulled taut like steel wire. Something or someone was approaching. Not a coyote, not an owl, not a deer. That silhouette walked like a predator. Helen switched off the light. Darkness swallowed the shed, leaving only the faint pulse of the blinking headlamp, more warning than illumination. She stepped to Soraya and the kittens, pulling an extra layer of towel around them. Then turned to Koda, whispering, "Don't leave the door. If anything happens, take them and run. You hear me?" Koda glanced over, his eyes shining in the dim glow, a look that said, "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the footsteps grew louder, grass crunching, maybe a branch snapping under claw. Helen knew from the chill up her spine, whatever it was hunting Soraya. Maybe a mountain lion, maybe the last apex predator in a land running out of prey. She turned to Soraya. Despite her exhaustion, the bobcat had raised her head, ears erect, eyes wide. Even in weakness, the mother's instinct had roared back. She let out a deep growl from her chest, not to threaten, but to warn. The sound blended with the night wind, but Koda heard it. Only him, and he understood. Koda slipped from the shed, circling toward the back, a shadow vanishing into deeper darkness. Helen lunged for the wooden door, grabbing the iron rod they'd used to secure the stall, and stood still. She didn't now know what was out there, but she would not back down. That night, in the thick black of darkness with danger circling and hope hanging by a thread, no one gave up. Not Koda, not Helen, not Soraya. And in that moment, Helen understood this battle, wild and brutal as it was also a trial, a test of love instinct and courage. The darkness behind the shed spread out like a chasm. There were no lights, no moon, only the scent of dry earth, old straw, and a silence so deep every footstep sounded like thunder. Koda moved like wind. His fur melted into the night, only his eyes shimmering in the dark. He drifted through scorched grass like a phantom heading toward the source of the sound. And then he saw it, a large shadow lurking behind the southern fence. Its movement was fluid, yet coiled with power. Ears erect, eyes blazing gold, glowing like fire when reflecting the faint shed light. There was no doubt now. A mountain lion, large, lean, but its shoulders were still powerful like springs wound tight. Its dusty golden fur was matted, scarred across the back. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. It took slow, deliberate steps along the fence, probing for weakness. Koda didn't bark. He stood about 10 meters from the fence, upright, head low, and let out a low growl, not to threaten, but to speak. I see you. This is the boundary. You do not cross. The mountain lion paused, its eyes locked onto Koda, a creature not of its kind, not an obvious threat, but one that didn't retreat. The night wind lifted the fur along its back, and for one still moment between two predators, a silent duel began. Inside the shed, Helen held her breath near the door. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel with the instincts of a vet who had seen too many brushes with death that Koda was facing something big and dangerous. She swept her flashlight across the room. Just warped wood, dusty corners, a straw roof. No sounds, no movement. But the feeling lingered. A hunter was near. She gripped the metal rod tightly, counting her breaths. Then Soraya let out a growl. Not the weak rasp of an exhausted bobcat, but a mother's growl. Protective. Fierce. It sent a chill down Helen's spine. Behind her, Soraya had risen, ears flattened back, arched. She nudged her 3 kittens into a corner, then turned to face the door. We are not alone, Helen thought. She'll fight if she has to. Outside, the standoff continued. The lion hissed a dry, metallic sound like sharpened steel. It had reached the boundary. One leap would break through the weathered fence and into the shed. And then Koda stepped forward. He didn't retreat. He advanced. No fear in his eyes. No rage. Only resolve. And something remarkable happened. The mountain lion stopped. Its ears twitched back. It sniffed the air and stepped back half a pace. Perhaps it sensed something, not just a single creature defending something inside, but a pack, a strange, unlikely pack of human, dog, and wildcat. A new ecosystem, an alliance never seen before. The lion growled quietly, and then without a sound, it turned and vanished into the night. Helen only realized it was over when she saw Koda returning to the shed door, his face still firm, but his eyes softer now. He hadn't won with fangs or claws. He had won with presence, with belief. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around his neck. Good job, Koda. She whispered, tears soaking into his thick fur. You saved us all. From behind, a soft whimper sounded. Soraya was lying down again beside her kittens. One of them, the smallest, was crawling out of the blankets, toddling toward the light, meowing in a tiny voice as if calling, "Someone." Helen looked at it, then turned to Koda. "She's calling for you," she said through tears and a smile. "This little family is growing, because of you." And that night in the old shed, where darkness once carried danger, there remained only one thing: peace. The first rays of dawn slipped through the window slats of the old shed. Light as velvet, the sun stretched across dry, straw-rotting crates, and the 4 sleeping lives curled together in their makeshift nest. 3 tiny kittens nestled beside their mother's soft-spotted form. Soraya. Koda lay at the shed's entrance, one paw draped over a wooden plank, his posture unchanged from the night before, still guarding. Helen awoke after a night slumped in a wooden chair. She rubbed her eyes, massaged her stiff neck, and looked around a scene that once felt impossibly far from the world she had known. A city-trained veterinarian, who once led 5-person surgical teams, now sitting in a wooden shed in the Texas wild, with a shepherd dog and a family of bobcats. And she felt more at peace than she ever had. Helen stood quietly and approached Soraya. She no longer had to guess. The look in those golden eyes had changed, no longer wary or panicked, but recognition. Not resignation, but trust. "Good morning, brave mama," she whispered. "Today is the first day of something new." Then she turned to Koda, her companion, who was no longer just a dog. He was the guardian, the bridge, the anchor between 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. "You deserve a medal." She smiled. "And you probably don't even realize what you did last night." Koda tilted his head, his tail giving a subtle wag. "Nothing more." That day work began early. Helen began reinforcing the shed. Steel mesh and wooden planks closed up the gaps. She hung a solar light above the doorway for easier night checks. And as she worked, she kept looking back at the bobcat nest. And each time she found Koda quietly lying in the back, his eyes half open, watching, calm, steady. Soraya was eating more. She no longer flinched when Helen approached with water or soft-boiled meat. She still didn't allow touch, but the space between them was shrinking little by little each day. And the kittens, tiny as fists, had begun crawling beyond their mother's side, wobbling like miniature warriors, setting off to discover the world. Helen recorded every motion in her old city clinic notebook. Next to every note: Kitten 3, right leg weaker. Kitten 1. Licked mother. For the first time she sketched fragile outlines in pencil, the lines shaky from emotion. She had once lost a mother and her young, a mountain goat, during delivery. That grief had been part of what drove her away from the city. But today, with gentle light, with the soft cries of new life, and with Koda lying there like a soul appointed to watch over all, Helen felt something shift. The weight of that loss was finally being replaced by hope. That afternoon, as the sun began to lean westward, Soraya did something that froze Helen in place. The wild bobcat, solitary, proud, once near death in the middle of a field, stood up, walked forward, and touched her head lightly to Koda's neck. A quick gesture, no hesitation, no plea. Just, "Thanks." Koda didn't react with surprise. He simply lowered his ears, then tilted his head, gently brushing her shoulder in return. Helen didn't write anything down. She stood still, hand over her chest. Her heart beat softly, because for the first time in her life she had witnessed a bond that defied species, that transcended even survival instinct. A dog, a wildcat, a vet, a family, and a mission that had only just begun. That evening, everything seemed to be settling into a peaceful rhythm. Inside the shed, Soraya was now familiar with Helen's presence whenever she entered to check and make notes. The 4 kittens were growing steadily. Their cries had grown warmer, softer, and one had even begun to open its eyes. Koda lay by the shed door as usual. Helen dragged a chair close to the enclosure, placed her laptop on her lap, and began typing her daily report to Mark, her former colleague, at the Houston Wildlife Rescue Center. They had begun discussing a possible research project on the rare interspecies behavior developing between Koda and Soraya. Helen sipped her now cold tea, smiling as she typed Koda and Soraya like legends come to life. But just as she was about to hit send, Koda shot up. His whole body tensed, muscles rippling. Ears rigid, eyes locked on the open field behind the house. Helen froze. Her heart tightened. No sound, but something was coming. "What is it?" "Koda," she asked softly. Koda didn't growl, didn't bark. He stepped back slightly, positioning himself between the door and the kittens. Inside the shed, Soraya had already lifted her head. Her ears shifted toward the wind. The kittens curled tightly against her, sensing the invisible danger. Helen opened the shed door, careful not to show fear. She knew this well. Animal instinct never lies. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped toward the backfield. The breeze was gentle, but the scent was not. A pungent, wild odor. The scent of a predator. Then a low, guttural growl from beyond the oak trees. Helen froze. She'd heard that sound before. Not a wolf, not a coyote. A mountain lion. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the shed. Koda inside. Now she shouted, but Koda didn't move. He leaned forward toward the darkness, ready to confront it. Inside the shed, Soraya let out a sharp growl, clear, strong, no longer the weak rattle from when Helen had first found her. 2 former adversaries now standing together, ready to defend their young from the wild. Helen backed into the porch, hands trembling as she unlocked the wooden emergency chest. She pulled out a wolf whistle and a high-powered floodlight. The darkness outside shifted. A large form crouched low appeared between the trees, its eyes catching the faint light near the shed. It was watching, calculating, waiting. Helen stepped forward and switched on the floodlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing squarely on a full-grown mountain lion, gray-furred ribs showing from hunger. It squinted, growled, and lifted one paw, stepping forward. "Don't," Helen whispered. "Don't do this." Behind her, she raised the wolf whistle, but didn't blow it yet. A part of her understood the creature was also fighting to survive, just as Soraya had once done. But Soraya had kittens now, and Koda was there. The choice was clear. Helen blew the whistle. The shrill sound ripped through the night. The mountain lion roared, staggered backward, then turned and disappeared into the trees. But before it vanished, its eyes lingered a warning. It would be back. Helen exhaled, legs trembling. Koda rushed to her side tail, wagging not in triumph, but in relief that she was safe. "We'll need to reinforce the shed." "Tomorrow," Helen murmured, clutching Koda's collar. "We're not just saving one family anymore. We're standing against the wild itself." From inside the shed, Soraya still watched the darkness unblinking. Dawn broke after a restless night. Helen hadn't slept. She sat on the porch, a cold cup of coffee in hand, eyes locked on the forest behind the shed. Inside, Soraya and her 4 kittens were still safe, but Helen knew that safety wasn't something she could guarantee forever. Koda lay beside her, his gaze alert, since the mountain lion's appearance the night before. No one had to teach him. No command was needed. He understood this place was now his territory, to guard with everything he had. Helen gently stroked his head. We have to prepare, buddy. There won't be a second chance." She went to the storage room, rummaging for old wire mesh nails, plywood, anything to reinforce the shed. First thing, after she called Roy the neighbor, who lived 2 miles down the road, her late grandfather's old friend, and a man who knew this land better than anyone. When Roy arrived in his silver-painted pickup truck, bringing a hammer chainsaw and several rolls of barbed wire, Helen exhaled deeply. "Heard that wolf whistle all the way from my porch," Roy said as he removed his gloves. "Figured you had an uninvited guest." Helen nodded, her eyes heavy. "Mountain lion. Big. Gaunt, but not afraid of humans. It knows we have easy prey, Soraya and her kittens." Roy adjusted his hat expression grim. "A hungry lion won't give up. If it came this close, it means it's marked this place as hunting ground. You need to decide defend or evacuate." "No," Helen said firmly. "I won't abandon Soraya. Not after she came to my doorstep for help. Not when Koda sees those kittens as his own pack." Roy nodded slowly. "Then we build a fortress." For the rest of the morning, Helen and Roy worked to erect a secondary perimeter around the shed, 3 layers of steel mesh motion sensor lights, and an infrared camera Mark had sent her for tracking wild behavior. On the roof, Helen stacked wooden planks into a second layer of shielding. Below ground, Roy dug trenches to bury wire mesh to prevent the predator from digging underneath. Koda shadowed every movement. At times, he stationed himself between the workers and the edge of the woods. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply watched. A silent sentinel. By noon, sweat soaked their backs. Roy sat on the porch step, took a swig of water, and looked at Helen. "You know," he said gravely, "your grandfather once told me, to live with nature, you gotta learn to hear its silence." Helen paused. Roy continued. "Last night it didn't roar, didn't howl. It waited. It watched. Mountain lions don't hunt with strength. They hunt with time." Helen stood still, the truth of that settling into her bones. Maybe the beast had been watching them for nights, measuring movements, mapping vulnerabilities. This fight wasn't about claws. It was about patience, a predator's patience. By late afternoon, Helen relocated Soraya and her kittens into the newly fortified shed. She carefully placed each kitten into a bed of fresh straw and watched Soraya's reaction. Soraya didn't growl. She didn't resist. She glanced at Koda, who had followed them inside, and then gently licked the top of his head. Quick, soft, decisive. Helen froze. From the doorway, Roy whispered, "Swear to God, I've never seen anything like that." Koda lay down just outside the mesh wall, head resting gently on the ground. Soraya curled herself around her young. That peace, nestled within the shadow of a lurking threat, made Helen feel as though she was witnessing something far beyond medicine. It was evolution. It was trust, defying instinct. It was a message from nature, if only humans would stop long enough to listen. As twilight settled, Roy packed up his tools, his hand resting briefly on Helen's shoulder. "I'll be back soon. But if anything happens, you know I'm 15 minutes away. And I always carry a rifle." Helen nodded. "I won't leave Soraya and the little ones." Roy gave a faint smile. "I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about you." Night fell, the third since the encounter. The infrared lights blinked on. Koda didn't sleep. Neither did Soraya. And this time, Helen was ready. Night fell like a heavy velvet curtain draping over the land. No wind, no chirping insects, no owls, no branches rustling. Only silence, so perfect it sounded like a warning. Inside the shed, Soraya curled protectively around her 4 kittens, eyes wide open, ears pricked. Koda lay at the entrance, head held high, muscles taut beneath his coat. He had sensed it. And this time, there was no doubt it was back. Helen sat in the corner of the shed, a stun gun beside her military-grade flashlight fully charged. Her eyes stayed fixed on the infrared camera screen. A large movement had appeared at the forest's edge, just over 20 meters away. "All right," she whispered. "This time I'm not letting you win." She pressed a button. The shed's floodlights blazed to life. A large silhouette instantly leapt backward into the bushes. Its eyes glowed in the light, like twin flames, silently burning in the dark. Koda whimpered not from fear, but from restraint. He growled low in his throat, as if saying to Helen, "Waiting for your signal." Helen slowly stood, eyes never leaving the monitor. She whispered to Soraya, "If it gets in, I don't know if I can hold it off, but I promise I won't let it touch your babies." Soraya hissed softly, not at Helen, but at the forest. A thin, deadly sound, a mother's instinct ignited like wind meeting fire. Camera 3, right side of the shed, blinked red. Movement. Very close. Helen activated the ultrasonic repeller, a high-pitched frequency whistle meant to deter wild animals. But this time, there was no reaction. "Koda," she said firmly. "Fall back. Guard the position. No chasing." Koda stepped back, positioning himself between Helen and the door. Then, from the unreinforced roof too high to secure in time, a shadow leapt through. Helen only had time to shout, "It's on the roof!" A loud crash, a wooden panel kicked down. The mountain lion's eyes flared above them, massive, gaunt fur matted with sweat and ash. Hunger had pushed it to the edge of instinct. Helen raised her stun gun but didn't fire. She knew if she missed, the cost would be all their lives. Koda, no more commands were needed. Koda leapt like a bolt of lightning springing from a stack of crates to a hay bale nearly touching the roof. With a bold lunge, he vaulted onto the rooftop face to face with the snarling beast. 2 guardians, 2 defenders of territory, and a single breathless silence between them. The lion hissed, baring its teeth. Koda didn't flinch. He let out a booming bark, so deep it echoed through the shed. He stepped forward. He would not retreat. Below, Soraya let out her fiercest hiss, yet claws raking the steel mesh, as if she were ready to join the fight. Helen, out of options, pulled the trigger. Pfft! The dart hissed from the compressed air gun, hit the lion in the thigh. It roared, stumbled, but didn't fall. Instead, it sprang off the roof, vanishing into the forest. Koda jumped down behind it, racing to the door, growling one last warning. But silence returned. This time the noise receded into the distance. It had retreated. Helen collapsed to the floor, her shirt soaked with sweat, heart pounding like thunder. She looked up at the torn roof stars, peeking through a clean gash in the wood, then over to Soraya, who now licked her kitten's eyes heavy, but ears still upright. Koda turned, stepping lightly over to Helen. She wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered hoarsely, "You're a hero. You know that." Koda licked her cheek. "Thank you, a comfort, or maybe just the purest kind of friendship between species." Helen looked up. A shooting star streaked across the night. Tonight, they had all survived. And tomorrow, they would continue the fight. Dawn gently laid a soft pink hue over the tin roof, now bearing a large hole, a scar left from the battle the night before. The first light of day slipped through the shed's cracks, touching Soraya's back, as she lay curled protectively around her 4 kittens. Her breathing was lighter now, steadier. The signs of exhaustion had given way to recovery. Helen stepped into the shed, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Her hair was haphazardly tied back with an old string. Her eyes were shadowed with fatigue, but behind them glowed something clearer than any medical treatment hope. Koda followed her in his coat, still dusted from the previous night. The scratch along his side had been cleaned. He didn't come because he was called. He came because this was his place now, a guardian, a keeper. Helen knelt beside Soraya and whispered, "You and your babies are a miracle." Soraya didn't growl. Instead, she raised her head eyes, meeting Helen's. It wasn't blind trust, but an acknowledgement. She was no longer alone. Koda stepped up quietly to the edge of the enclosure, lay down, resting his head on his front paws. His eyes followed every twitch of the wriggling kittens. No one spoke. None needed to. Days later, Roy, the seasoned neighbor, returned with a small truck full of supplies. "Heard the story from Mark," he said. "Jesus. Helen, you really don't know. Fear, do you?" Helen chuckled, the first real laugh since moving here. "I'm scared, but I think I fear helplessness more than wild animals." Roy patted the side of his truck. "I called some folks at the ranger station. The southern forest where that mountain lion might have lived has been surveyed. They're considering setting up a monitored semi-wild reserve, a place for animals displaced by drought and habitat loss." Helen nodded. "I want to release Soraya there, when the kittens are old enough." Roy squinted. "And you'll stay. Turn this place into a real rescue center." Helen glanced toward the shed, a place that 3 weeks ago had been nothing more than an abandoned storage shack, now a sanctuary for lives no one thought could be saved. She nodded, not to run from the past anymore, but to build something I believe my grandfather would be proud of. Mark returned the following week with a wildlife GPS tracker documents from a conservation group and a folder containing an official research grant proposal. The first document co-authored by Dr. Helen Ruiz and subject Koda. Koda was recorded as the first documented case of interspecies empathy between a domestic dog and a wild bobcat in a birthing emergency. A behavioral biology council from Colorado had sent an invitation to speak at a symposium. Helen laughed. "He doesn't do suits." Mark grinned. "A bow tie will do." The release day came sooner than expected. The 4 kittens, Sierra, Luna, Nova, and Shadow, were old enough to leave their mother. They climbed, pounced on imaginary prey, and tangled around their mother's legs like living striped ribbons. At the gate of the reserve, Helen removed the last GPS collar from Soraya's neck. Koda stood beside her, not stepping forward. He only watched a deep, steady gaze, a farewell that needed no sound. Soraya turned, touched noses with Koda. A moment brief quiet when 2 worlds brushed against each other. Then she walked away. The kittens followed. They vanished into the trees. Helen clenched the collar in her hand, eyes stinging, but her heart light. That evening, Helen and Koda sat on the porch. The night no longer held threat. A breeze passed softly. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove cooed. "Koda," she whispered, "you did something neither science nor I could have predicted." Koda tilted his head, gave a quiet whine. Helen smiled. "Yeah, I know. There's more to save. More lives, waiting for a place to be heard." And in her heart, a voice echoed. Not from the deep woods, but from deep within herself. "Welcome home, Helen. In a world where survival instincts often drive species into conflict." The story of Helen, Koda, and Soraya reminds us that compassion knows no boundaries. Between wild instinct and human reason, sometimes it's kindness itself that builds the bridge where miracles happen. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share the video, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you more stories of healing and quiet wonder. And don't forget to leave a comment. Where are you watching from? Do you believe in empathy that transcends species? See you in the next journey, where hope always finds its way home.